Bonjour, welcome everyone. My name is Colin Burrill, Director of Alumni Engagement and Community Partnerships at the Telfer School of Management. The Telfer School has a strong history of organizing and delivering activities to engage alumni and provide alumni and business community with opportunities to learn about and explore important topics of interest. These Telfer Talks, as we call them, are now being delivered virtually through webinars such as this. As most of the organizers and presenters today are in Ottawa, I'll begin with an Indigenous affirmation. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this history, with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So before we formally begin with the first presenter today, I'd like to say a few things about this webinar. Please note we are conducting this in English only. It will be recorded and emailed to all participants in a few days. The presentation itself will also be shared in a post-event email. And you can use the question and answer feature in this event to add comments, questions, react to other people's messages, and participate in the Q&A portion of the event. So first off, I'd like to introduce Ian Cullwick. He's a partner at Mercer's Ottawa office. He joined Mercer in 2015 after having served as Vice President of HR and Organizational Research at the Conference Board of Canada. And the other presenter today will be Manon Laliberté, who has an undergrad degree with a concentration in psychology from the University of Ottawa, as well as a Telfer MBA. After working for 5 years as an HR consultant for Deloitte, Manon's transitioned to the parapublic sector. Since 2015, she's been working as HR manager at the Ottawa Hospital with a main focus on the area of total compensation. So welcome Ian and Manon, and I will pass it over to you.
Good, all righty. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and for those of you in Western Canada, good morning. My name's Ian Cullwick, and Jen, if I could get you to go over to the strategic context slide. So our pleasure to be with you. Excuse me, essentially we're going to cover off two key topics, compensation strategy and in response to the pandemic, and then number two, the implications for key performance management practices that most of you, if not all of you, are dealing with. So so the first slide is likely rather intuitive for everybody, but I thought I would spend a few minutes just in terms of the strategic context around compensation. So for example, if you look at the wheel on the left-hand side of the slide, yes, many of the, if not all of the core ingredients or components to your overall compensation strategy are indeed being impacted. I mean, if you start at 12 o'clock, your compensation philosophy, the values and how you develop, guide, and manage and even govern compensation, that's being impacted. As I work around the wheel, board and executive compensation, and then of course workforce compensation. By the way, in terms of research insights and anecdotes that I'm going to share with you over the next couple of minutes, by the way, coming from some Mercer North America and Canadian pulse surveys done literally over the past 2 weeks, I will focus on board, executive, and workforce compensation. Other components in that wheel, though, that I think we need to keep in mind: legislative requirements, they're not going away. For example, the Federal Pay Equity Act, which will come into force likely sometime this fall or early in 2021 in terms of the 3-year trigger date. Collective agreements, for those of you, and many of you are unionized, those collective agreements are real. Your labor relations and union relations relationships are really important in this day and age. And of course, communication. Those are all key ingredients. So if I just go to the right-hand side, you're going to hear over the course of the next 45 to 50 minutes that, of course, we're seeing dramatic differences from sector to sector. Take the healthcare or food supply chain, broader sector, culminating in the grocery retail sector. The health and the grocery sectors, of course, are being implicated in a very different way than consumer discretionary sectors. We're going to touch on some of those differences. Absolutely the need to take a total compensation approach. This is not just about base pay. Other elements to today's immediate reality, wellness, the importance of your benefits programs, and from an organizational perspective, how you're managing mental health and financial wellness, absolutely never more important. The importance of government relations and partnerships, especially for those of you that have had to tap into wage subsidy programs or the CERB or other types of programs. And quite frankly, how do you balance urgency and agility with the how and the economics of what you're dealing with? And finally, just to wrap up on this slide, bullet one, the ever importance of governance oversight. Many of you, I suspect, are having active conversations with your board, with your HR or compensation committees, because dramatic policy changes are being made, amendments are being made, and I'm going to touch on in a few minutes, by the way, for example, trends with respect to even board compensation, let alone executive compensation. So your boards and your oversight entities through your board of directors are playing a key role in this. Number two, the importance, even though many of you are having to move very quickly to make very dramatic, urgent changes, we would advise you to think about scenarios and cost modeling in a big way to determine what specific levers you're going to play with and make changes to. Bullet three, there are dots, there are interdependencies here that are quite profound. We're not going to cover them, of course, today, but I just want to highlight a few. Organization design, work design, job design. So for example, many of you may be moving to part-time work, reducing the number of hours back, furloughs. Some of you may have to be dealing with layoffs. But I want to touch on furloughs. Quick anecdote, in my case, I've got a large Canadian construction company that I do work with. Through the month of April, they had to drop down their tools, and they were terrified about losing critically important, high-skilled roles. So think of apprenticeship trades. For example, unique welders and welding skills. This particular company didn't want to lose those unique welders, so they furloughed them. They were kept on full pay. There was no work going on in April. And of course, across most of the country, the construction sector is now back up. So we know that some of you are having to make difficult decisions, and some of those difficult decisions, though, are your need to keep, especially those knowledge intensive and highly skilled roles on your payroll, because if you let them go, you may not get them back. And we're already seeing the economy rebounding back, certain sectors coming back, so these are key considerations. The power of good labor relations and the dialogue with your union representatives, your shop stewards, those conversations are really key. And of course, how you do this now is going to have implications for your culture and the mid and longer term. One of the key themes that we at Mercer have been advising clients on is balancing, and here's the phrase, balancing economics with empathy. So it's not just about the what, but it's about how you do it. Okay, Jen, if we could go to the next slide. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me just spend a few minutes on board compensation, because our research both in Canada and the US is clearly indicating that yes, indeed, we're seeing some material changes to board compensation. So again, the data sets that I'm sharing with you are coming out of various pulse surveys that we're doing in North America and globally over the past 1 to 3 weeks. So the first point, 2/3 of responding US companies actively reducing board compensation. And by the way, in terms of annual retainers, typically it's a median reduction of about 25%. 80% of responding Canadian companies are pursuing reductions as well. Again, the median annual retainer reduction is about 20%. Bullet 3, 1/3 of US companies are indicating a temporary suspension of annual retainers altogether. So whatever that retainer is, it's being suspended from anywhere from 3 to 12 months. And by the way, in some cases, the feedback we're getting is we don't know when we're going to reinstitute our retainers. So really it's when this pandemic plays out. So again, suspension of retainers altogether is starting to happen. 20% of responding Canadian companies are temporarily suspending retainers as well. And again, for a median period of about 3 months, so a bit more definitive in terms of the period of time. Now, these dramatic changes in terms of board compensation are predominantly happening in likely some pretty intuitive sectors in your respective minds: the energy sector, the industrial sector, and of course the consumer discretionary sector. So this is a backdrop. I received an update from Mercer North America actually this morning, and I can tell you these general trends have not changed at all. So they're still in play. All righty, Jen, we'll go to the next slide, please. So executive compensation. So again, we're starting to see some dramatic developments, and by the way, these dramatic developments did start to come into play in sort of early to mid-April as well. And you can see the tagline in the top left-hand corner. Of course, from a multi-sectoral perspective, no one size fits all. So what I'm going to share with you are general trends and some specifics where I can cite them. But again, how this is playing out does vary from sector to sector. Again, the healthcare sector, the retail grocery sector, industrial supply chains that are into PPE manufacturing. Some of these businesses, you think of the Canada Posts of the world, their parcel business, for example. I'm sure it's booming because of how we're all interfacing with the retail sector. So specifics. So with respect to executive compensation, responding Canadian US companies, and by the way, about 365 in total. Most of them are indicating, profound executive base salary reductions, typically a range from 20 to a high of 50%. And I'm going to get to some specific update numbers in a minute. Minority of companies have suspended CEO base salary altogether, and typically for a duration of 3 to 9 months in duration. So some companies are suspending CEO pay altogether. Most are not. Typically, it's some sort of reduction. Bullet 3, enterprise-wide and individual performance management programs, of course, are being upended. I mean, we're reading day in and day out of publicly traded companies that have actually suspended quarterly financial forecasts to the analysts and the investor community. So enterprise-wide financial targets, quite frankly, in many cases, they're in the garbage because they're just not relevant. So this is having a profound impact. Now, a quick aside in terms of the impact on short-term incentive rewards, and this was a data update that I picked up this morning. So in a Mercer Canada survey with a sample of about 325 companies, 76% of those companies indicated that they're going to continue with their existing individual performance management plans and the short-term incentive target rewards. However, in all of their responding cases, they indicated that it's highly likely that target payments will not be funded or triggered. So the plans are going to play out based on their architecture, their minimum thresholds, and the varying degrees of payout. But the recognition is it's highly unlikely that full targets are going to be realized this year for all those obvious realities. Interesting, 24% have said that they're suspending or dramatically altering those short-term incentive and performance management programs. So again, a fair bit of change. Bullet 4, a real increased focus on team-based or enterprise-wide performance and not necessarily the individual. Again, this really comes down to line of sight and what's controllable. I mean, just think of, for those of you that have sales representatives or account managers, those quantitative targets are profoundly altered. So there's a big move now to how the enterprise performs financially and non-financially. And by the way, and I think this is fabulous, with a real focus on quality, customer relations, and the health and welfare of the organization and its culture. Again, executive pay adjustments, I've talked about this already, again, profoundly in a negative way, hitting the energy sector, various industrial subsegments, and of course, in a big way, consumer discretionary subsectors. I'm just going to go down to the third last bullet. In Canada, you know, the pay reductions, again, just to highlight these, 20 to 50% base pay reductions for CEOs where applicable, 10 to 40 for executives, and 10 to 15 for mid-managerial. Now, just to give you literally breaking updates from Mercer research coming out this morning, you know, I can tell you the median, so this is key, for Canadian companies, the median CEO base pay reduction is actually 20%. The median for the executive cadre is 15%. I don't have a data set for mid-management, but I can tell you for employees, for non-unionized employees, the base pay reduction is about 10%. So for those sectors, those are the numbers. And you know, the last bullet on this page, there are a minority of companies out there that are actually deferring the base pay reduction or the base pay suspension to some sort of point in time in the future. And in some cases, it's, you know, gee, if in exchange for a base pay reduction of 10, 15, 20, or 25%, where it's a publicly traded company, there is the possibility of a deferral or an exchange in things like stock options or grants. One last comment that's not on the slide, and I'm going to date myself. I can tell you going back to sort of 2001 and then 2008, 2009 in terms of economic recessions and the dot-com crash. If some of you can remember, there was something out there called stock option repricing initiatives. Well, guess what? They're potentially coming back. It's a complex thing to do from a tax point of view, but because of the economic climate, some companies are now looking into stock option repricing strategies and programs to deal with, you know, significantly underwater stock option or other types of equity programs. So just a heads up, that's starting to happen. Thank you, Jen. Workforce compensation, you know, again, predominantly negatively impacting energy, industrials, and consumer discretionary. And again, on the flip side, as we're all reading about and seeing firsthand, the grocery sector, the healthcare sector, for example, in the media over the past couple of days, of course, we know that the provincial government, for example, has topped up long-term care hourly rates of pay. My colleague Manon will talk about the healthcare sector because, of course, she's with TOH. So in some sectors, we're seeing top-ups. You know, retail grocery clerks, of course, have received $1, $2, or $3 per hour top-ups. And again, think of this: if somebody's making $15 to $20 per hour, and they're getting $1, $2, or $3 more per hour, rightly so, I would add, you know, that's representing sort of a 5 to a 15%, you know, pay increase. So these trends are out there. Furloughs and permanent layoffs, of course, are unfortunately happening, given the economics of certain sectors. Where you can do it and preserve people even on the payroll for 1 or 2 days of work per week, and keep people on the payroll, that allows you to, of course, from a legal perspective and an HR strategy point of view, maintain benefits and or retirement, you know, defined contribution payment mechanisms on a biweekly basis. So preserving those benefits where you can do them. Starting to see voluntary leave programs. So this is, gee, do we have, especially for knowledge intensive or professional services businesses, do we have employees that want to work 3 days or 4 days a week? Or is that being prescriptively dictated that we're going to roll things back to 3 or 4 days a week? I know of one professional services firm, for example, that's gone to 4 days a week, but the base pay is being kept at 83% of the norm. So in other words, there's a 3% premium as a bit of an offset. Third last bullet here, you know, again, I've already talked about reductions in base pay. Now, again, for non-unionized employees, we're typically seeing reductions in the neighborhood of 7.5 to 10%, where people are being kept on full time. And then, you know, back to my example of where someone is rolled back to 4 to 80% of effort, but receiving 80 or 83% of pay. So these kind of practices are increasingly being observed, but again, typically for knowledge intensive businesses. Last couple of points, and then I'm going to move on. We are seeing a bit of a move to early retirements and voluntary buyouts. So, in other words, some of you are looking at these circumstances and the pandemic as an opportunity to do some right sizing. Perhaps some individuals are saying, well, you know what, perhaps I'm going to use this as an opportunity to actually retire. So, so that kind of activity is happening. And then the last point, of course, is very thoughtful management of the CERB, the wage subsidy programs, how those are administered, how they're funded. Requires a lot of careful, thoughtful work and really good connections with the applicable government agencies that are making this happen. I am hearing federally that the federal government has done a really good job in terms of, you know, moving resources in to administer those programs. My last slide is about workforce support, just to finish up, and then I'll pass things on to Manon. You know, this is good to see. This is around mental health and physical and even financial wellness. You know, specific things are happening in terms of unique actions to support one's workforce, predominantly observed in the consumer staples sector. So I'm just going to focus on the consumer staples sector. Some research we've done, 40% of companies in the TSX Consumer Staples Index announcing pay premiums. Now, again, this data is about 2.5–3 weeks old, likely more of this at play. And even one-time appreciation bonuses of $200 to $1,000. So some unique things are happening for, you know, very good reason. 8 of those TSX Consumer Index companies indicating creating, you know, hardship funds to support employees within their respective employment systems. Increased focus on benefits programs, and by the way, moving to digital portals for how employees can access these programs, and for example, get digital access to EAP providers like Morneau Shepell. Last point here, and I'm going to come back to this when we finish off in a few minutes, employee communication is critically important. What messages, what are you sharing, how frequently, and by the way, who's conveying that message? And that actually can be quite complex to do, so we'll have some thoughts on that in a minute. So I'm just going to pause. I'm now going to pass things over to my colleague Manon Laliberté. And again, Manon is an HR manager with the Ottawa Hospital and a former colleague of mine in Deloitte Consulting many years ago. Manon, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. So Ian took us through these more specific trends of what's going on in terms of changes to compensation, and I'll kind of take more of an applied perspective from a frontline manager role. So Ian, the segue is great because Ian was talking about communication, and essentially in terms of the guiding principles for any big change that we're doing in an organization, I would say that this is the most critical one. In terms of developing a clear communication plan, so anything related to compensation, of course, compensation is people's livelihood. People are stressed. There's a lot of fear going on. There's a lot of uncertainty. So the way that we're communicating changes is absolutely critical. Having a solid and clear communication plan within your organization is key, but also the line managers need to fully understand what the key messages are, and they need to be delivered consistently. So we all know that employees talk within an organization, and if these messages are not consistent, they will lose trust in the organization, and I think it'll create even more headaches in terms of multiple questions and having difficulty answering them. So that's really a key point. Being honest and transparent. So it's okay not to know what's coming up next, and it's okay to communicate that as well. But I think the key is communicating. And so, what I've seen in certain organizations is that messages such as, we're not envisioning layoffs at this time, but we do not know what the future holds. So at least, being able to deliver a message in that way, tells people that, yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty coming up, but at this time, this is where we're at. And as Ian mentioned, it's all about consistent touch points and providing updates. A quiet organization is always a bit tricky and concerning for employees. So, go out there and be comfortable talking. Agility and flexibility. So when it comes to compensation, organizations typically have some very a firm strategy in place and firm initiatives in place. We're facing an unforeseen crisis where again there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of questions out there. So we need to be able to think outside the box. So some of the things that you never thought that you would be dealing with, we are dealing with now. So we need to be creative. And to be creative, we also need to consult with the right stakeholders. So that's always important. If I've learned something over my career, is that I've had great ideas about initiatives that I wanted to put forward and may not have always consulted the right stakeholders. So when it was ready to press that go button, I got a lot of raised hands, and we kind of had to go back to the drawing board. So before doing anything, before moving forward with any change, it's key to be able to connect with those stakeholders, identify them, meet with them, have conversations about what's feasible and what's not feasible. And when I think about stakeholders from a compensation perspective, being in HR, I think about payroll, I think about the HR information management team, I think about labor relations. I think about everyone who's going to have to actually implement these changes. It's really a critical piece to make things work. And then under agility and flexibility, it's be fair and consistent. So we can be agile, we can be flexible, but what is key around compensation, I'm sure we've all dealt with this before, is we need to be fair, we need to be consistent. As soon as there's a perception within an organization that there is a lack of fairness, again, employees lose trust within the organization. That doesn't mean that we're doing exactly the same thing for everyone. We'll talk about it a little bit later around some changes to compensation will be tailored to specific groups depending on the needs of the organization and depending on how we segment the organization. But clear criteria needs to be put in place to ensure that we're making the right decisions. And I remember a leader telling me one day, like, any decision that we make, we need to be comfortable posting it on our front door. So always think of that. Always think about where the decisions are coming from and the comfort level, and being able to provide a rationale around that decision. And then collaboration. Ian spoke about this a little bit as well. Unite rather than divide. If you're in a highly unionized organization, if your relationships are a bit difficult right now with the unions, or if you have had a history of difficult relationships with the union, now might be the right time to try to rekindle a bit of those relationships. I'm not saying that it's easy, but a lot of the changes that you're going to want to put forward will be highly regulated by the collective agreements. And coming back to that idea of thinking out of the box, we need to be able to work together. And then invest in building relationships. So in the healthcare sector, we do have a close relationship with our healthcare peers, so other hospitals within the country. If you're in other sectors as well, parapublic is usually easier. There's more collaboration. There isn't really as much of a competitive note that you would see in the private sector. But this is really a time where we put our heads together and we work through things together. All right, Jen, next slide. So considerations prior to change. So on the left here, these are just examples of some of the changes that are happening right now when it comes to compensation. And the reality is, regardless of the changes that you're looking to potentially make, there are key considerations that need to be thought through before moving forward. And Ian and I were having this discussion around trying to find a balance between speed and implications. So there is a need to move quickly on some of these changes. However, moving too quickly will have other unforeseen and potentially negative effects. I'll speak about those a little bit later. So taking these considerations, seeing them as being important and critical is really key to moving forward with any change. So I'll go through them. Internal equities, of course, internal equity, making sure that our decisions are fair within the organization. And that trickles into pay equity. So Ian, again, touched on that a little bit. So pay equity being equal pay for work of equal value when it comes to female dominant positions. And so if there are any changes being considered within your organization, for instance, providing a premium to a certain employee group, you need to consider if this employee group is a male dominant group that's being used as a comparator as part of your pay equity plan. You need to consider that potentially this premium needs to be applied as well for the female dominant groups that were part of your analysis. So, moving again too quickly and not considering the pay equity implications, once you're evaluating how much your adjustments are going to cost, if you've missed that, you can see that those costs will increase significantly. External trends. So you also want to take into consideration what your competitors and your peer organizations are doing out there, mainly from a recruitment and retention perspective. So if a peer organization or a competitor is offering a premium and you are not, then you might see some loss in terms of key talent within your organization. Same thing, if you're paying an additional premium, that's great because you're bringing potentially more people in, but then you need to weigh out from a financial perspective, is that worth it and was it necessary? We talked about collective agreements. Again, collective agreements are key. That's why the relationship with the unions will be critical as you work through some changes. Because there's a lot of uncertainty and we're not really 100% clear about what's going to come next. You know, I think a lot of the changes that are made, we do need to keep a mid to long-term kind of perspective in mind. However, things should probably be agreed upon from a without precedence and prejudice perspective to ensure that there's more flexibility in making changes down the road as we see the landscape unfold. So I wrote here talent acquisition and reacquisition costs. Again, if you are deciding to lay people off, if you're looking to make changes to compensation and losing key talent, there are huge costs related to acquiring talent. And sometimes we forget that. We kind of look at the immediate cash flow that comes with letting people go or reducing compensation. But as things start up again, we need to remember that costs are huge to be able to hire people. And that needs to be taken into consideration when you're doing your assessment, your cost analysis. We talked about long-term implications, so always seeing down the road in terms of what the changes today are going to look like in the future. Budgetary constraints. So when I think about the healthcare sector, this is always a huge consideration. So again, keeping in mind what are these changes going to cost? Have I taken a good look at all of the other components that need to be considered in my analysis? We talked about communication. Ian talked a little bit about corporate values as well. So taking that into consideration when you're making decisions. So now is really the time to walk the talk, right? So depending on what your corporate values are within the organization, you want to make decisions that are aligned with those. The decisions and the actions that we're taking right now are going to paint the picture of what we look like in the future. And finally, the government programs and initiatives. Of course, there's a bunch of programs out there, and new ones are coming to light as well. So, you know, really being well versed in those programs and those initiatives to be able to give you a boost and you know, ideally try to support your staff as much as you can. And Jen, perfect, thank you. So this is my personal point of view. So the first one here, social responsibility versus survival. As organizations, you have a corporate social responsibility and, you know, towards your community, and a big part of your community is your staff. So, you know, the question is, should organizations do everything that they can to be able to keep their staff employed and paid? And personally, I would say yes. I think that is, it is a key responsibility. You know, employees give a lot of themselves to the organization. And I think the organization does, you know, owe them that type of support. However, there's a need to balance that need for responsibility or taking care of your staff with, you know, will the business actually survive if we move forward? So it's finding that balance, but always keeping that in mind, and again, aligning it with your corporate values. Know your workforce. So Ian gave a great example of one of his clients who decided to keep some skilled trades positions on payroll, keeping them paid because there was a risk of losing them. Especially, we all know that skilled trade is scarce in the market right now. So you need to know your workforce. So I talk here about workforce segmentation, where we're really looking at the value and the uniqueness of skills within our organization and understanding the different roles that we have. And this allows us to identify, you know, which jobs are really difficult to attract, or what type of roles are we having a hard time retaining. Sometimes it's because of a high level of specialization or education, and sometimes it's because the market, we're just not seeing these roles in the market, so it's very difficult to find them. So before making those compensation-related decisions, if you understand your workforce well, you're able to tailor different strategies to be able to essentially get the results that you want at the end of the day. And then beware of the ripple effect. So again, I kind of mentioned this earlier. Any changes in compensation that we make, if we make them too quickly, there are a lot of unforeseen consequences that can come up. So we talked about pay equity, we talked about internal equity. Often, anyone who's in compensation knows you start to calculate, you do the financial modeling, and once you meet with stakeholders or once you start opening it up, you see that there's a lot of other risks out there. There's a lot of other unforeseen items that weren't considered in the analysis, and that can end up costing a fortune or having the opposite effect as well in terms of wanting to attract or retain staff. So really, we need to move quickly, but not too quickly. So we need to take the time to go through those considerations before making any changes. So I'll pass it back over to Ian. We'll talk about performance management.
Good, good. Thanks, Manon. So ladies and gentlemen, just to finish the session off, we're going to go to performance management. And, performance management has become a really key topic, especially for those of you that have had to dramatically move to, some sort of a virtual business model where you've got employees working from home and simply not in the office. So it's a big topic. For some of you, you've already been dealing with mobile workforces and or some degree of virtual business models. So this may not be that new for you. So context. Clearly, the pandemic has had a profound impact on this. And by the way, one of the key themes I would leave with you would be the trends that we've all been seeing and some of us experiencing over the past 1 to 2 years. They have truly now been accelerated because of the pandemic. So, contextual applications as I start this off. So you need to think about, so from a strategic and philosophical perspective when it comes to performance management, why are you, what is the purpose of your performance management program? And I'm talking, as the Venn diagram illustrates, enterprise-wide, team, and individual. So why are you doing it? I mean, are you doing it to drive more focused accountabilities? And by the way, we would argue the pandemic is driving more focus on accountabilities. Are you having to recalibrate goals and objectives? Are your measurement systems ironically becoming more qualitatively driven because of the time we're in? Because, again, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, those of you that are private sector and or commercial not-for-profit enterprises, those quantitative, operational, and financial targets that you may have set at the beginning of your fiscal year, they may no longer be relevant. Pay for performance. I mean, how relevant is pay for performance in this day and age, and how does your PM program support that? Learning and development really focused on wellness. Longer term career planning, applications in performance management, likely sidelined because none of us are really thinking beyond the next 1 week to 3 or 4 months. And quality management, performance management has now become a key driver of quality management. So these are contextual applications, and rhetorically, how do you use these to be supported by your performance management program? Jen, we'll go to the next slide. So just to sort of remind everybody in terms of the trends that we saw evolving to literally, Saturday, February the 29th, maybe this year is unique because it was also a leap year. So literally to the end of February into early March, there were a number of emerging trends that we were all seeing. The first one, of course, better balancing not just the what, in other words, the outcomes, but also, gee, how are we going to achieve things? So those causal levers, the how we're going to influence the what or the outcomes. A bit of an interesting trend in terms of, moving away from some ratings. I mean, in the media, many of us have seen articles, and this may apply to some of you, that, my gosh, we're going to move away from the individual annual performance rating. Now, I personally would argue those businesses that are doing that or that we're reading about, they're doing it because they've actually got very sophisticated enterprise-wide planning and measurement systems. Number two, they're very knowledge intensive and project-based, and I can guarantee you their project management protocols include very sophisticated performance measurement practices. So they have those practices as well. And number three, typically they're pretty sophisticated when it comes to competency-based measurement systems. So be careful about the no ratings theme, but again, it's out there. But I would argue those companies that are moving to not having individual ratings actually do have very sophisticated measurement practices. Learning and development inclusion. you know, moving beyond the annual one-off conversation, so moving beyond the legacy or old school performance appraisal and the annual conversation. Those days are over. This goes to more frequent conversations to drive feedback, constructive growth and development, and of course, all having an impact on quality control and the quality that you're delivering to your customers, your patients, or your clients. Selectively using 360, so 360 is out there, but of course, as most of us know, it can become quite complex and administratively burdensome. Second last bullet, absolutely a trend to canvassing employee interests and aspirations. So rhetorically, think about this for a second. For those of you that have, you know, good, mature performance management programs, do you have a simple question that asks the employee about his or her career interests or aspirations? Many don't, but I would argue many should. And then some thought leadership, of course, from the second best business school in North America, Harvard Business Review, has produced some really interesting articles on emerging trends in performance management on fostering improvement, learning and growth, strengths and praise. You know, a really interesting one about a year ago, by the way, January of 2019, was a thesis that said, use your performance management program to simply focus on individual and team strengths and praise and how to further leverage those. So it's an interesting paradigm. So those again were key themes up until the start of this pandemic. Now, let's go to this next slide. Thank you, Jen. You know, post February 2020, what are we seeing? So if you look at the left-hand side, and again, this likely applies to many of you, dynamic and uncertain targets. You know, for those of you that locked in your fiscal year enterprise-wide plans and measures and targets, and how that distilled down to your teams and your individuals, many of it may not be applicable anymore. You know, the impact of virtual and mobile workforces, the implications of dramatically moving to digital and work processes. The second last one on the left-hand corner, the role of line managers and line supervisors, really key here. This is really, really key. And going to their spans of control. And so a quick anecdote for you. You know, for those of you that have line managerial roles or frontline supervisors with broad spans of control, 1 to 40, 1 to 50, 1 to 60, your performance management practices for those line managers and people managers will be very different from your line managers that have spans of control of 1 to 3, 1 to 4, 1 to 6. By the way, quick anecdote for you. The average all industry span of control in Canada is 1 to 7. Now, of course, you've got to peel the onion back and go to particular industry sectors because things will vary from sector to sector. But I pick on spans of control because they have profound implications for the performance management role of your line managers or line supervisors. I mean, as Manon can attest, I mean, if you're the nurse manager on a midnight shift in a hospital, you may have a span of control of 1 to 30. Others in a hospital may have a span of control of 1 to 4. And if you're expecting your line managers in this day and age to have close contact and coaching and mentoring and guidance and communication updates with your employees, that performance management expectation will be profoundly impacted by one span of control. So I share that as an anecdote. And, you know, the impact on quality control. So today's reality for performance management, you know, post February 29th, pretty dramatic. And I would argue the trends that we just talked about up until the end of February are now being accelerated. Bullet 2 on the right-hand side, this is really key, especially for those of you that have had to move to, you know, virtual business models and workforces. A big move to role-based performance management standardization. In other words, you know, your ability to have customized incumbent or employee-specific performance management plans really difficult to execute in a virtual world. So from a quality control, productivity point of view, you do need to move to clarifying, you know, gee, what are the 2 or 3 key performance standards or outcomes that are expected in a particular job or role or within a particular occupational level, and reconfirm those and communicate those, because that becomes your quality control mechanism. That becomes the key interface or reference point that your employee who's working from home will now have. So that is really key. Role-based versus incumbent-based. Bullet 3, a reality today, a real focus on the enterprise and the team. I've got some professional services firms that, quite frankly, individual performance management is likely not going to be applicable or in use in this particular 2020 year. The focus will be on teamwork, contribution, and an enterprise-wide focus, which really goes to the next bullet, which is more of a focus on those qualitative metrics. How did you contribute to the team? The support, the health and welfare. How are you focused on our key accounts, customers, and patients? As I move down this list, a real focus and an active accountability and performance management on wellness and safety. This is really key. How are you taking care of your team and your people in unprecedented times? And how does that translate into leadership and enterprise-wide performance management practices? Communications and conversations, we talked about those because they're absolutely critical. And again, back to my last comment here on the critical importance of line managers and frontline supervisors. So rhetorically for you, to what extent are you confident you've got clarified delegated authorities? In other words, to put this another way, to what extent do your frontline supervisors and managers know what conversations they can have with employees, what commitments they can make to their frontline employees, and what they can do with customers and clients? And that really goes to clarity of those 3 or 4 key delegated authorities down to that frontline managerial level. And I would argue most organizations actually haven't thought that through. And as Manon indicated a few minutes ago, for you to have clarity of consistency and what can be discussed and what cannot be discussed, you need to think about how all of that plays down to those frontline supervisors. All righty, Jen, if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So just as I wrap up, again, the tagline here, and I know this is intuitive for all of you, one size does not fit all, but there are some key considerations in terms of making the new realities of performance management work. The impact on your business model and your work design, working virtually or not. I know many of you are starting to think about how do you return to the workplace. These are key considerations. Delegated authorities, again, administratively, the delegated authorities can become quite complex. Focus on the 2 or 3 key delegated authorities that you need to have in place for your line managers, your frontline supervisors, and quite frankly, even your frontline employees. And making this happen, again, if you look at this wheel, managerial job design has what we're living. Is it having an impact on the role of managers? So think of retail grocery stores. Absolutely, those frontline managers need greater delegations of authority because they've got to make in the moment spot on decisions with customers. Think of the complexity of what they're dealing with. It's incredible. Spans of control, communications, we've talked about that. So these are really the key ingredients for how to make this new reality work. Keeping things simple, keeping things focused, keeping things team-based, and possibly making the tough decision that, gee, those quantitative targets that were put in place 3, 5, 6 months ago, especially for those of you that had calendar year fiscal years, they may no longer be relevant. And you may have to make a tough decision to actually park those quantitative targets because they're just not relevant. They're not under the control of those employees, teams, and managers. And I mean, if you get this wrong, as Manon noted a few minutes ago, it'll have profound implications in the immediate short term. Health and wellness, productivity, customer and client relationships. If you get it wrong, it can be quite damaging. So it does need to be thoughtful. Okay, we'll just go to the last slide. Thanks very much. So look, just as we wrap up and with a particular focus on performance management, yes, you've got to be agile, agile and flexible, and really are you willing to make those tough decisions to do a reset? And some organizations are doing fundamental resets, and that's a tough thing because, by the way, when you connect these dots, for example, with respect to executive compensation, is your board or your finance committee or your HR/comp committee, are they willing to do a performance management reset vis-a-vis whatever variable pay compensation programs you have in place? That's a major decision. Now, as a quick aside, and most of you know this, in most good terms of reference for comp committees or HR committees, there is a clause at the board's discretion, given extraordinary circumstances, one-off agile policy resets or changes can be applied. I think we would all agree this pandemic is perhaps one in a century type thing that's extraordinary. It's for many of us, it's in many legal frameworks, it's quote unquote an act of God. So are you willing to reset? 2, moving to team-based performance management. Really things need to be team-based. Thoughtful and frequent communications. Number 4, keep things as simple and as consistent as possible. And number 5, setting yourself up to have those engaging and supporting conversations that your employees are looking for. And again, we know that's tough, especially for those of you that have fairly, horizontal type organizational designs and business models where you may have high spans of control that may be challenging for that particular manager to find, meaningful time, even if it's 5 minutes with, if I've got 25 employees reporting to me, how do I find 5 to 10 minutes per week? That could be a challenge. So Jen and Colin, I'm going to pause there. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much. And I think we have about 10 to 12 minutes for any Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Ian and Manon. There's definitely a lot to unpack there. A lot of great comments and points. I think Ian mentioning the balancing economics and empathy, and Manon looking at really making sure your corporate values are helping you walk the talk during this once in a century global health issue. And having that basically paint the picture of how you look internally and externally for, probably for decades to come is very important here. So we do have a number of questions. Some of them were submitted earlier, some have been posted, and so I'm going to try to combine a couple. And I guess the first question is a bit around this balancing economics and empathy. And so basically, from a performance management perspective, it's tricky in practice to balance that economics and empathy perspective. So how do we practically and empathetically take into consideration the change to an employee's circumstances? So, this is, now they're at home, they're basically teacher, parent, employee, mental health coach, etc. And how do we do that while still maintaining a pay performance model? When setting and following through on expectations, how do we get out in front so that people believe they're being treated fairly?
Yeah, so Colin, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I would say 2 perspectives from me. Number 1, you're going to have to make tough, difficult, prescriptive decisions. So make those decisions. The key though is, as long as they may not be liked, but they will be respected. So it's all about respect. Employees will respect it if it's consistently applied. Now, having said that, in point number 2, I think the reality is, and we all have these circumstances, some or many of your employees may have to work at home. School is out, at least in Ontario. This is really complex. The work-life circumstances for employees with young children. This is going to be tough. So my point 2 really is, you need to have a tolerance for some flexibility, because this time and age is requiring that flexibility and that tolerance for flexibility and what that looks like. So consistency, which yields respect on the one hand, and then a tolerance for some flexibility on the other hand. Manon, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think I would agree with you, Ian. I think one of the questions that you need to ask your employees is what can be done to help you out here? What's your situation? It's taking that time to understand what the individual situations are, and to Ian's point, it's being flexible. So, you know, changing work schedules. Maybe it is changing the number of hours worked and moving from full-time to part-time, but that consistency is key. And I think that really finding that balance is critical.
Great. Okay, so then the next question is, how are organizations recognizing the line managers and frontline supervisors who may be required to deliver this extraordinary effort and outcomes during the pandemic? So you mentioned, you know, making sure that there's greater delegation of authority to those staff. How can organizations better recognize them?
Yeah, good question. You know, especially it's a tough circumstance for frontline supervisors and managers that are working in those businesses where the financial or the economic model has been dramatically hit or damaged, because in the context of a regular short-term incentive reward and the financial triggers to fund a bonus pool, those may be irreparably damaged or constrained. So what I'm seeing are really two things. Time off, number one, so paid time off, and number two, spot rewards. So it could be something like, you know, $1,000 or $1,500 as some sort of spot recognition or reward. Those are really the two key mechanisms. Now, I'm seeing with a small minority of my own clientele where they're actually bringing in more frontline managers. So it's interesting. I mean, we can all relate to this. I mean, there's been a theme in labor markets and organization design for literally the last 5, 10, 15 years to delayer and, you know, push more down to line managers and go to broader spans of control. The irony right now is spans of control, I would argue, are being shortened, and in some cases, additional supervisors or managers are being brought in because of the workload requirements and the need to have more touch points with employees. Manon, any perspective that you've got vis-a-vis TOH or the healthcare sector?
You know, I think it's when it comes to management, it's definitely a challenge. And when you think of overtime pay, for instance, and that management's not eligible for overtime pay, it becomes tricky when you have leaders that are, you know, maybe putting in different levels of effort and time, especially time. So now we're seeing this with the pandemic just exploding. So I think to Ian's point, looking at different potential benefits that are being increased, it might be time off. It's, you know, if it is spot rewards, the critical piece is figuring out what the criteria is, and that's not always easy to identify and to apply consistently. So definitely, you know, taking the time to identify what that looks like, documenting it, and being able to speak to it for sure.
Great. And so here's another question. So how do you see the pandemic and the related HR and compensation changes, you know, impacting labor relations and collective bargaining, you know, down the road?
Yeah, that's a really loaded question, Colin. Yeah, well, thank you. I think the short answer is a lot of uncertainty. I think it's going to have an impact on the planned durations of collective agreements. I think, as everybody can relate to, or those of you that are collectively bargained, you know, for the last 10 years or so, we've seen a trend to longer collective agreements. I think we'll likely move to a trend of shorter collective agreements. It's going to be complex. You know, on a related note, and it's actually, Colin, I'm just going to tie this to a question that came through on my iPhone. You know, for those organizations that are collectively bargained or even non-unionized, but are not having to reduce any elements of base pay, are they looking at freezes or what's the impact of all of this in terms of compensation planning for the new fiscal year or for 2021? And the anecdote I would share, and again, this comes out of a Mercer Pulse survey that was released this morning with 308 companies that responded. We're seeing an increase to the number of companies that are doing freezes. They're doing freezes on the one hand, and they're pushing back or deferring when they would typically do their annual compensation planning. So, you know, the operative word is uncertainty and the impact it's having on freezes and or your regular budget planning and compensation planning cycles. And then with respect to collective bargaining, you know, that's a big, tough question. Manon, your point of view, because I know the Ottawa Hospital, of course, is dealing with 4 or 5 unions. Your perspective on this?
Yeah, I think your point about, you know, potentially some shorter collective agreements, but also being comfortable with putting in some flexible agreements, in the sense that, you know, it's not something formal that we're putting into the collective agreement forever, because we all know that oftentimes when we are adding to collective agreements or making changes, there's this sense that, okay, now this is set in stone and it's going to be very difficult to change it moving forward. We're in so much uncertainty right now that conversation with the union needs to be, this is what we're looking at in the short term. Let's document it in this way. Let's have touch points to review it, and then have that flexibility to be able to change it. But that the intention needs to be very clear, and the understanding needs to be clear as well.
Colin, just one more thing on this that I want to add. I don't know the answer on this, but I'm going to suggest that collective bargaining, those unions and employers that go into collective bargaining for frontline employees across all sectors, this pandemic is a bit of a game changer in terms of, you know, I think a heightened awareness and respect for the value of what frontline employees are bringing to our lives. So I think that'll be a theme in there as well. How that plays out, I'm not sure, but I think it's going to be a key thing.
Great, yeah, great points. And, you know, I could see, you know, hopefully shifting from more that us versus them, you know, positions to the real collaboration during this pandemic. So I think with that, we'll wrap it up. I do want to thank Ian. You know, I think it's great, you know, having you as one of the professors in our executive MBA program. You know, thanks for participating today, and Manon as well for you know, that the research, the comments, and really the insightfulness within you know, this very complex topic. So thank you very much. Thanks to our behind the scenes producers today, Genevieve and Jennifer. I think things ran fairly smoothly. And for everyone participating, thank you. Please keep an eye out for a thank you email that will contain an important survey. Please take a few minutes to fill that in, and you will receive a link to this presentation and a link to a number of our other webinars that are coming up over the course of June, and we're looking to have a couple into July. So thank you again, and also we will have a recording of this presentation in the following days. So thank you, merci, and please have a great day and a great weekend, and stay safe and healthy. Take care.